Rescue workers are still going through the wreckage of the two jetliners this morning in the Canary Islands. They're looking for the bodies of victims in this worst accident in aviation history.
From the Tenerife Airport Disaster of 1977, where two Boeing 747s crashed into each other while trying to take off, to the infamous Concorde crash which claimed over 100 lives, the aviation industry has recorded hundreds of disasters since its inception. Join us as we take a trip back in time, exploring disturbing stories of the 10 most horrifying plane incidents in history. Number 10. Tenerife Airport Disaster. March 27, 1977. A fully loaded Boeing 747 was preparing for takeoff at the Los Rodeos Airport, now known as Tenerife North Airport. Aboard the plane were 248 passengers and crew members, all on their way to Gran Canaria. At the same time, another Boeing 747 operated by Pan American Airways was also taxiing on the runway, carrying 396 passengers and crew members. But what no one realized was that this was about to become the single deadliest plane crash in the history of aviation. Behind the KLM flight was Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, accompanied by First Officer Klaas Meurs. As for the Pan Am flight, it was piloted by Captain Victor Grubbs, alongside First Officer Robert Bragg and Flight Engineer George Warnes. Neither of these aircraft was supposed to be at that airport that day. Along with other aircraft, they were forced to move from the Gran Canaria Las Palmas airport located nearby, following a bomb explosion. But unlike the Gran Canaria airport, Los Rodeos was much smaller. It had only one runway, a parallel taxiway, and very limited aircraft parking spaces. Added to this, the weather was also quite terrible that day. According to the crash report, the Pan Am aircraft had less than 100 meters of visibility on the runway. The KLM aircraft, on the other hand, enjoyed good visibility when it started to take off, but as it traveled further down the runway, the visibility began to reduce significantly. Unfortunately, neither of these aircraft could see the other trying to take off at the same time. Around 4:56 p.m., the tower gave the KLM aircraft clearance to taxi the runway length.
Taxi into the runway.
And leave the runway third to your left.
Third to the left, okay.
And line up for takeoff at the other side. 6 minutes later, the Pan Am aircraft began its taxi along the runway. In the middle of this confusing situation, there was a miscommunication between the tower and the KLM flight. As soon as the pilot of the Pan Am aircraft saw the KLM heading its way, he tried steering the plane onto the grass and out of the way. But unfortunately, it was too late. Both aircraft crashed into each other, and fuel got leaked, resulting in a blazing inferno that completely destroyed the two Boeing 747s. 583 people lost their lives that day, becoming the biggest fatality in any aviation incident.
In the horrible air crash in the Canary Islands, what is known now is that at least 578 people died.
Thankfully, 70 passengers made it out alive, although 9 of them would later succumb to their injuries. Number 9. Japan Airlines Flight 123. On the evening of August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 departed from Tokyo Haneda Airport, headed to Osaka, Japan. The aircraft in question was a Boeing 747 SR, which had been serving the airline for 11 years.
Japan 123 was a domestic flight.
However, just 45 minutes after takeoff, the plane crashed into a ridge on Mount Takamagahara, killing 520 people on board. Only 4 survivors were recovered from the crash site, and the incident became known as the deadliest single aircraft crash in aviation history. But why did this perfectly healthy plane suddenly fall from the sky in the middle of nowhere? The true story began 7 years earlier on June 2, 1978. The same aircraft, operating as Japan Airline Flight 115, was on its way to Osaka. The trip from Tokyo had been smooth for the most part, but everything changed as soon as it touched down. All of a sudden, the aircraft bounced heavily, forcing the pilot to pull back on the central column. This resulted in a severe tail strike that injured 25 of the passengers on the board and cracked the rear passage bulkhead open. No one died this time, and the aircraft was repaired and returned to service. For the next few years, the aircraft continued to fly without any incident. That was until that fateful day in August 1985. The Boeing 747 was soaring 24,000 feet above the ground when it suddenly suffered a decompression. The force of this decompression was so severe that the ceiling inside the cabin collapsed immediately.
And it indicated that the airplane had had a catastrophic problem.
All 4 hydraulic lines controlling the aircraft were cut, and the vertical stabilizer was separated from the body of the aircraft. In the midst of all the chaos, the flight crew sent out a distress signal to the Tokyo Air Traffic Control, who then gave the pilots radar vectors to follow for an emergency landing. However, with no hydraulics or vertical stabilizer, there was nothing the pilots could do. The plane had become virtually uncontrollable. The Boeing 747 was moving in circles, rolling side to side, and oscillating at dangerous speeds. The situation looked dire, but the flight crew wasn't ready to give up. Out of desperation, the pilot tried an asymmetric thrust in an attempt to regain control and stabilize the aircraft.
Captain, the R5 Massive stopped!
He then lowered the landing gear and extended the flap as they prepared to make an approach. But this was when things really took a dark turn. Within seconds, the aircraft started nose-dropping and banking to the right. Minutes later, it struck the trees on the mountainside. The right wing then clipped a ridge, and the aircraft began to break into pieces. The force of the impact was so great that many of the passengers died instantly. However, the crash has also been a subject of controversy for decades now.
We were very highly suspicious that this was a bomb.
You see, situated close to the crash site was a United States Air Force base. However, as soon as they heard about the crash, they were told to stand down and wait for the Japanese search and rescue team. Unfortunately, the location was so remote that the team didn't show up until the next morning. By the time they arrived, only 4 of the survivors were still breathing. The rest had died from shock, overnight exposure high up in the mountains, and injuries that would not have been fatal if they'd received medical treatment on time. The pilots of the aircraft are hailed as heroes, as they managed to keep it flying for 32 minutes, even after the controls were severely damaged.
You can imagine this Boeing man became very, very upset, personally was crying.
Sadly, political tension and lack of emergency response caused the death of 520 people, a number that should have been much, much lower.
We had to request permission to travel and to work with the Japanese.
Number 8. China Airline Flight 120 runway explosion. August 20th, 2007. China Airline Flight 120 was on a regular trip to the Naha Airport in Japan. The journey had proceeded as planned, and the plane successfully landed at the airport. The aircraft in question was a Boeing 737-800, carrying 165 people. As per normal procedures, the passengers were radioed to leave the aircraft. But moments before the door was opened, tragedy struck. Out of nowhere, fuel began leaking from the right-wing tire, resulting in a huge fire. It was the ground control personnel who first saw fuel pouring from an area near the second engine pylon as the plane landed. But there was nothing they could do to remedy the situation.
Hey, what is this?
What's happening?
At first, the captain had no idea what was going on. He just knew something was wrong with the aircraft. But then he heard, "Fire! Fire!" through his headset, and immediately looked out the window only to see the plane engulfed in smoke.
Dynasty 120, we are calling a fire truck. Remain standby.
He knew the first order of business was to evacuate the passengers. But first, he and the first officer had to go through a standard evacuation checklist. This took a couple of minutes, and during those moments, the cabin had become filled with smoke. The passengers were coughing, choking, all while fearing for their lives.
No pushing, no pushing. Please keep moving forward.
But as soon as the checklist was done, the captain opened the hatch and the passengers were allowed to escape. One by one, they filed out the door, while the pilots were forced to stay behind. They couldn't leave until every single passenger was off the plane. That was the risk that came with the job.
Typically, the captain will stay until everybody's off and he will verify that the airplane is empty.
Unfortunately, by the time the evacuation was done, the whole cabin was almost engulfed in flames. Amateur footage taken by an aircraft control official showed the moments the plane then exploded, breaking the entire plane into half. Thankfully, the pilot and his co-pilot managed to escape through the right cockpit window at the last minute. For the first time in a very long time, a deadly crash of this magnitude resulted in no deaths and no injuries.
to get this many people off in such a dire circumstance in a very short period of time with no injuries is miraculous.
It would later be discovered that the accident had been caused by a cocktail of different factors, all of which came together to create this horrifying memory for the passengers. But while they managed to escape unhurt, the same cannot be said for the passengers and crew of this next flight. Number 7. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370.
370, 3 to right of takeoff.
It's been over 10 years since Flight MH370 vanished out of the sky, taking 209 people along with it, and nobody has been able to figure out what really happened that day. The story began around midnight on March 80th, 2014. The flight, piloted by Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, was on its way to Beijing, China. Nothing seemed out of place as the plane lifted off from the airport in Kuala Lumpur. But everything changed as the plane left Malaysian airspace. At this final moment, air traffic control officials received a final message from the pilot. Goodbye, Malaysian Flight MH370.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
After this message, everything immediately fell silent. By standard protocol, Captain Shah was required to check in with the Vietnamese air traffic controllers upon entering the country's airspace, but the officials never received any transmission from the plane. 2 minutes after the final message, MH370's transponder suddenly went off. This meant that no radar would be able to track the movement of the aircraft, so everyone was basically blind. Did the pilot disable the transponder, or was there a malfunction on the plane?
This is not going to be a good outcome. A big airplane like this, losing radar contact, it usually ends up in tragedy.
Nobody really had answers. Later, advanced military radar and satellites were able to pick up signals from MH370. They claimed that the plane turned around and began traveling over the Andaman Sea, heading back to Malaysia. It then flew for hours and hours before possibly running out of fuel and vanishing for the last time.
Malaysia Airlines flight with 239 people on board, including 4 Americans, has gone missing.
The following morning, the Malaysian government informed the world about the plane's disappearance, and a massive international search was kick-started.
Flight MH370 ended in the southern Indian Ocean.
But despite intensive efforts from several countries, including Australia, China, and the United States, the plane has still not been found. 17 days after the incident, the Malaysian government concluded that the plane had crashed down in a remote corner of the Indian Ocean, killing everyone on board.
And that its last position was in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
Since then, several government-sponsored searches have been launched. Private organizations have also attempted to retrieve whatever is left of the plane from the bottom of the sea. Since then, a couple of fragments have been found in different locations.
Are highly likely to have come from that plane.
A good example was in July 2015, when someone found the flaperon washed ashore on Reunion Island in the western Indian Ocean. This was the first hard evidence proving that the plane may have truly crashed. However, all search efforts by the government have been suspended since 2017, and the private investigators have also slowed down as the time goes by. But for the families of the victims, the story is not yet over. Many are still hanging on to hope that maybe someday they'll get answers as to what really happened to their family members. Some claim that the pilot was trying to end his life and decided to take the others with it. Others claim it was aliens who snatched the plane from the sky. Some conspiracy theorists even believe that the United States or Russia may have been involved in this whole scandal. The truth, however, may never be revealed until the end of time. Number 6. Rogue Learjet goes down in South Dakota. Since the inception of the aviation industry, there have been several stories of ghost planes soaring through the skies, but none can be as creepy as the Rogue Learjet that crashed in South Dakota back in 1999.
News of a Rogue Learjet flying hundreds of miles off course has captivated the nation.
The story takes us back to October 25th, 1999, when a private Learjet 35A, operated by Sunjet Aviation, was on its way from Orlando International Airport to Dallas Love Field. There were 6 people aboard the plane, including 2 members of the flight crew and 4 passengers. American PGA golfer Payne Stewart was one of the passengers, but unfortunately, he never made it out alive. The plane, which had been in operation for 23 years, had amassed over 10,000 flight hours. There was enough fuel to power the plane for hours, and while this was an advantage at first, it would later spell trouble for everyone on board. Shortly after acknowledging a clearance from air traffic control to climb to 39,000 feet, all communications suddenly ceased from the pilot. No matter how hard they tried, the air traffic control officers couldn't get across to the pilots. After several failed attempts, the officials decided to send a fighter jet to intercept the rogue plane. It didn't take long for the fighter pilots to catch up with the Learjet. According to their report, the private plane appeared to have sustained no damage. The only problem was that the cockpit windows were opaque with ice or condensation. This meant that they couldn't see inside. Unfortunately, after flying uncontrolled for almost 4 hours, the ghost plane finally ran out of fuel. It then began to fall at a very sharp angle, traveling at near supersonic speed, before crashing into an open field near Aberdeen. All 6 occupants died instantly. So what exactly happened on this flight? Well, according to investigators, at some point during the flight, everyone inside the plane was knocked unconscious by a loss of cabin pressure. But since there was nothing wrong with the plane itself, it continued to fly around and around until it couldn't go on anymore. Before we go on with the rest of the video, here's our subscribers' pick for today. As we explore some of the most horrifying plane incidents in history, check out this strange image that recently emerged on the internet. There you can see a group of flight attendants who appear to be half naked while inside the airplane. Was this part of an extra package for first-class customers? No one really knows. However, many have claimed that this immoral culture of flight attendants engaging in sexual acts with customers isn't a new story. Have you ever been harassed by a flight attendant during a trip? Or do you think these stories are just fabricated? Share your thoughts with us in the comments down below. Now, let's get back to the video. Number 5. Concord AF 4950. July 20th, 2000. Air France Flight 4590 was on its way from Charles de Gaulle International Airport near Paris to John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The flight was a Concorde airplane, one of the fastest in the world.
It's really a wonderful machine. It's been described as a beautiful white bird and described as the white rocket.
Unfortunately, this was the day that the Concorde legacy was destroyed forever. The flight has been rented by a German company named Peter Delman Cruises to transport its wealthy customers who were on their way to board the cruise ship MS Deutschland for a 16-day cruise. However, disaster struck as soon as the plane was cleared for liftoff. It appears that the aircraft was at maximum takeoff weight for ambient temperature and other conditions.
We talk about flying above 55,000 feet into a deep, deep blue sky.
And was 1,790 pounds over the maximum structural weight. So as it left the gate, it began to tilt away from the center of gravity. Some say the number 5 wing tank was overfilled. Others claims that the whole thing was caused by a minor engineering error. You see, prior to the flight, a 12-inch spacer that would normally keep the left main landing gear was replaced. This was part of the maintenance process, but it would later spell trouble for the plane. Instead of taking the time to taxi to the other end of the runway, the crew decided to go with a tailwind takeoff. As the Concorde was trying to lift off, one of its tires was ruptured by a piece of debris lying around on the runway. It was the pieces from this ruptured tire that then sent a pressure shock wave, puncturing the number 5 fuel tank. Fuel started leaking, and both engines lost power. The plane burst into flames from behind, and even though the pilots tried to land at the nearby Le Bourget Airport, the plane eventually crashed into a hotel, killing everyone on board.
And a half after commencing its takeoff roll, Flight 4590 crashed onto a hotel at La Patte d'Oie in Gonesse.
This was the only fatal incident involving a Concorde airplane. However, it became one of the final nails in the coffin for the company, sending them into the airline graveyard. Number 4. The Mystery of Flight 19. Around 2:10 p.m. on December 5th, 1945, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers took off from a naval air station located in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. What started as a routine training flight soon turned into a horror story after the flights mysteriously disappeared. The planes, which were collectively known as Flight 19, were scheduled to undergo a 3-hour exercise known as Navigation Problem Number 1. They were supposed to head east from the Florida coast and then conduct bombing runs at a place called Hens and Chickens Shoals. The plan was then to turn north and head over to Grand Bahama Island. The team would then change course for the 3rd time and fly southwest back to base. All the planes carried a crew of 3 Navy men or Marines, except for one which carried 2. Each of these men had clocked in around 300 hours of airtime, so there were no newbies or amateurs among them. In addition, The team was led by a man named Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor. Taylor was an experienced pilot who fought valiantly in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War. Everything started as smoothly as planned. Taylor and his pilots flew over hens and chicken shoals around 2:30 p.m. They dropped their practice bombs without any problems. But then something very strange happened as they began the second leg of their journey. For some reasons, Lieutenant Taylor claimed that his Avenger's compass was malfunctioning and that they'd all been flying in the wrong direction. Soon after this, a front blew in, bringing rain, gusting winds, and heavy cloud cover. Because of this, all the men became heavily disoriented. They didn't know where they were, how they got there, or how to return to base. Lieutenant Robert F. Cox was flying near the Florida coast on this same day. The flight instructor was the first to overhear the radio communications from the patrol, and he realized that something was seriously wrong. Immediately, Cox contacted the air station, informing them about the situation. He then reached out to the Avengers to ask if they needed any help. In response, Lieutenant Taylor informed Cox that his compass had stopped working and that he didn't know where exactly he was. The man sounded anxious, as if aware of the impending doom coming his way, but there was something else wrong with Taylor's analysis. You see, he had made his scheduled pass over Hens and Chicken Shoal just over an hour earlier. So how could his planes have drifted hundreds of miles off course, ending up in the Florida Keys? Something wasn't adding up, and there was no time to figure it out. The more he tried to find his way back home, the further he traveled towards the sea. As more time passed, his radio transmissions became increasingly faint. Fuel began to run low, and officials could hear Taylor prepping his men to crash land in the ocean. A few minutes later, the sound from the radio was replaced by an eerie static buzz. The men were lost, and all attempts to find them ended in failure. Many conspiracy theorists have attempted to explain this story. Some claim the men were swallowed up by the Bermuda Triangle. Others believe Taylor intentionally led his men on a death mission. Till today, neither Taylor's men nor their aircraft has ever been found, and the mystery behind the disappearance remains unsolved. Number 3. Fine Air Cargo Flight 101. The Miami International Airport receives dozens of cargo planes every single day. Most of these flights land safely, but sometimes the airport also records huge tragedies. Like in August 1997 when a Fine Air cargo plane crash-landed while trying to take off. The plane, headed for the Dominican Republic, was carrying nearly 88,000 pounds of pants parts. But as the captain tried to lift off, it suddenly bounced into an open field near the airport. After landing with great force, the plane exploded, sending a massive fireball into the sky. The momentum kept it skidding across 4 lanes of a busy highway and into a parking lot filled with cars. Eventually, the nose came to rest inside a computer store. Unfortunately, the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and security guard inside the plane perished in the accident. Luckily, those were the only casualties. According to reports of the crash, it was all thanks to the pilot that more people didn't die in the incident. This was because he managed to maneuver the plane to it from heading into the busy streets of Miami, causing a level of carnage America had never seen. Many even consider it a miracle that the crash didn't affect the motorists on Milam Dairy Road, as well as the workers in a warehouse just west of the airport. But despite the minimum casualty recorded, several businesses were destroyed that day. For one, huge chunks of the turbine came crashing into the front window of Hexium Computers, located in the International Airport Center Mall. There were balls of flame everywhere, and the employees had to escape through the hole created by the engine. Huge pieces of burning parts were spread across the 6-lane expressway. One by one, they burst into flaming fireballs, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Cars were scattered in front of the strip mall like toys. Some were even launched into the front of the building like shrapnel from an explosion. Eyewitnesses recalled hearing loud bangs before seeing the plane explode from a distance. However, it's still unclear what really led to the crash. Some claim that the plane was overloaded. Others believe it was some maintenance failure. But for the people of Miami, the incident will remain etched in their memories forever. Number 2. Aloha Flight 243. Dallas, Texas, April 28, 1988. A Boeing 737-200,000 was on a trip from Hilo to Honolulu. No one could have predicted that this ordinary flight was about to become one of the most disturbing airline incidents in history. Before it took flight, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 had undergone an inspection by the first officers, who didn't find anything unusual. Around 1:25 p.m., the aircraft departed from the capital, carrying 5 crew members and 90 passengers. But as soon as it climbed up to 24,000 feet, tragedy struck. Suddenly, the plane was rocked by an explosive decompression. It only took a few seconds for the roof to fly off the aircraft, leaving the passengers in the open mid-flight. Clarabelle Lansing, a 58-year-old flight attendant, was in row 5 when the incident happened and was instantly ejected into the open sky. At the time, the plane was being piloted by the co-pilot, but after seeing how big a trouble they were in, Captain Robert Schornsteimer took over the controls. His plan was to steer the aircraft and begin an emergency descent to Maui. Believe it or not, the plane eventually landed safely, without a roof. As a matter of fact, Lansing turned out to be the only fatality. However, 7 passengers, as well as another flight attendant, sustained serious injuries during the incident. As for the rest of the passengers and crew, no one sustained even a scratch despite the severity of the incident. It would later be discovered that one of the passengers had reportedly noticed the damage to the plane while boarding. However, he failed to report it to the crew. According to findings made by investigators, the explosion was caused by a fissure in the upper row of rivers along the Stringer S-10L lap joints. As for the aircraft, the damage was way too much to be repaired, and it was later dismantled and sold for scrap. Number 1. American Airlines Flight 587. Shortly after taking off on November 12, 2001, American Airlines Flight 587 developed some serious problems. The plane had just departed from the John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, headed to Las Americas International Airport in the Dominican Republic. On board this aircraft were 260 people, including 251 passengers, as well as 9 crew members. As it taxied to the runway, the air controller warned American Airlines 587 of possible wake turbulence from the jumbo jet that flew before it. About 2 minutes later, it took off from the runway and began its initial climb. But shortly after leaving the ground, the aircraft began to make a left turn to climb to 5,000 feet. It was during this left turn that the aircraft suffered a minor jolt, which experts believe was due to the wake turbulence the traffic controllers warned about. To steady the aircraft, the pilot moved the rudder from left to right multiple times. Unfortunately, these rapid climb and roll moments caused high forces on the vertical stabilizer. Before anyone could figure out what was happening, the stabilizer had separated from the aircraft, falling into Jamaica Bay. Suddenly, the Airbus A300 began to pitch downward due to the lack of vertical stabilizer. Seconds later, it rolled to one side and entered into a deadly spiral. Despite efforts by the pilots to steady the plane, it ended up dropping from the sky, crashing into a residential area of Bell Harbor, New York. Everyone on board lost their lives that day, along with several other people on the ground. The impact of the crash was so devastating that the Airbus widebody was completely destroyed. In addition, 4 homes were also leveled, while 6 more sustained different levels of damage. The left engine was thrown straight into a gas station, causing serious damage. As for the main wreckage, it was found burning some 4 miles away from JFK, at the intersection of Newport Avenue and Beach 134th Street. Later investigations revealed that the crash was caused by the force of air moving across the rudder due to the excessive use of the rudder during the rapid movements. And although it's been years, memories of the crash still linger in the minds of New Yorkers who witnessed the horrors. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.